Hello and welcome to today's briefing on China tariffs, hosted in partnership of the House Committee on Strategic Competition between the United States and the Chinese Communist Party and Rethink Trade. Thank you for joining us. I'm excited to turn it over to our speakers for today, Lori Wallach and the ranking member of the committee, Congressman Krishnamoorthi, to talk about such an important and salient issue in trade policy. Lori, over to you.
Well, I think I really appreciate the Congressman leading this briefing and as the ranking member of the China Special Committee. And I think our plan is to have a conversation where it's a question and answer discussion between myself and the Congressman, and then we will open it up for questions. So it's an honor to introduce Congressman Krishnamoorthi as the ranking member and someone who has been a leader on the China issues. A lot of confusion we hear from people on the Hill of what exactly is going on with tariffs. So I'm going to turn it over to you. You know a lot of these answers, but I understand you think it would be helpful for everyone else to ask some questions and hear the answers, and then we'll have a conversation.
Well, absolutely. And thank you, Lori. And I think everybody already knows Lori, but she's the director of Rethink Trade program at AELP and a 30-year veteran of international and U.S. congressional trade battles. And it's a real pleasure to be able to be with you and to ask you some questions. I'm going to just get started here because I think everyone would like to hear kind of your thoughts. I'm just going to ask an open-ended question. Can you just kind of give us a little bit of background on what has happened up to this point? It seems like there's so much happening every day, but if you can kind of maybe lay it out so that we can kind of think about it in a structured fashion, if possible, that would help. That would be helpful.
Yes, the if possible is the key piece there, but yes, sir. So just for everyone having the same timeline. So February 1, President Trump makes an announcement. He's putting tariffs on to Mexico, Canada, and China. So February 3rd, tariffs go into effect on China. Initially, it's 10%, and it covers all goods. So just as a footnote, these are tariffs on top of the tariffs that already were in place under the Section 301 action of Trump's first term, plus the Biden administration had increased tariffs on a variety of products, some of which weren't subject to tariffs under the original 301 action. So some of these tariffs now are stacked. And then I just want to drop a footnote. Then there actually were additional tariffs that were put on steel and aluminum. And so that stacks on top. And those are 25%. So depending what the product is, starting out on February 3rd, it was 10%. Then China retaliated against those initial ones on February 10. And then President Trump came back and said, oh, yeah, another 10%. So currently under IEEPA, and we're going to explain these different authorities, I think, IEEPA, there's 20% tariffs in effect on China, in addition to 25% with respect to steel and aluminum from China, in addition to any anti-dumping or countervailing duty tariffs, in addition to what are 100% tariffs that the Biden administration put in place on Chinese EVs, batteries, some other equipment, as well as 50% tariffs on Chinese solar and some other goods, medical goods, etc. So if you look at all of that and just serve as a footnote on that, from the original tariffs of Trump's first term on China, there's a dispute over what the effective rate, because there were different levels of different things, but one version of the effective rate is about 19% tariffs that covered about $350 billion of stuff, but it wasn't until this new set of tariffs that some things that had been excluded were getting hit at all. So the 10%, now 20% is on everything, but it's on top of the other stuff. And the only other thing.
Can I just ask you a dumb question? So just to take a nice round number, say something was like $100, okay? And let's say that it was subject to the 100% tariff under Biden. So it would be $200 or $100 of tariff essentially, or $200 to the consumer or the person that's actually buying the stuff. Why don't we back up? what do they apply the percentage to? Is it the price that the exporter from China is now charging to the customer here in the U.S.?
So tariffs are charged on the wholesale, so not on the retail. So,
Okay.
One of the very interesting things is there's a very interesting National Bureau of Economic Research study on what were the consumer price implications of the tariffs charged on the wholesale prices of those imports, $350 billion of stuff in Trump's first term. And what that study found, which is against what conventional wisdom assumes, is that most of that expense, again, charged on the wholesale, was paid for, absorbed out of the profits of the actual companies who were the wholesale purchaser. So let me give you a concrete example. Let's say a brand name tennis shoe company knows some very popular shoe can sell for $100. They know they're going to make the biggest margin, the most money, selling at $100, because if they made $120, they'd sell less units. So $100 is what their research shows. Now, that shoe comes in from China or Vietnam at $20 or $25. I'm going to make it $24 because we want to put on a 20% tariff. So or let's just do 25% tariffs, but easier to do the math on. The tariff is the $6 of 25% of the 24% actual wholesale price. So now a tennis shoe being sold for $100 costs the importer, the wholesaler, $30. And this could be true as well, for instance, of some manufacturer who brings in a part. The wholesale price, as you're making whatever it is to then sell and mark up and sell to the consumer, is where the tariff is charged. So
because they have so much profit, $70, they're not going to jack up the price to $106.
They don't pass it through. It's called a pass through. They don't pass it through to the retail price. And so obviously it depends what the margin is for a particular good. So it depends on the good, what the tariff rate is, and it depends how much ability there is to absorb it. But one thing, Congressman, to keep in mind is that this moment there are record corporate profits and record low corporate taxes. So the ability to absorb in a lot of sectors is significant. And that's what the studies show happened the first time.
Do you think that is, I'm probably going off script, I'm sorry, but do you think that might help to inform in part Trump's or the president's or the White House's thinking on this, that they feel that somehow corporations are going to absorb this tariff and not pass it along to consumers because of what you said? Is that part of their thinking here?
I don't know what their thinking is. I myself would not probably leave it up to the goodwill of the corporations. I think one of the things that the Trump administration should be doing, as well as the Congress should be doing, is putting into place price gouging laws and regulations with respect to tariffed goods. So it is whether a consumer price goes up is a two-part choice of the companies that are, one, choosing to buy an import as either an input or as the wholesale good they're going to retail. So they're getting an import, and they're particularly getting an import from a country that's subject to tariffs. Now, we don't know what these new tariffs are going to be like on April 2nd. We understand they're going to be targeting the countries that have the big chronic global trade deficits. But, you can choose to source from another country or domestically. So the first choice is you get an import that's tariffed. Then the second question that a company decides is who's going to take the wholesale price. Is it coming out of the profits because you want to keep the price the same because your research shows that's your most profitable point, and it comes out of your margin, or do you try and pass it through? Or worst case scenario, we've seen some cases where there are no tariffs and companies are saying because of tariffs we're raising prices. So we all heard the press coverage about can you hear me? I'm getting a signal that you can't hear me.
Lori, we can hear you just fine.
Okay, sorry. You all saw the coverage that washers and dryers prices went up. That was in the news all the time. But here's a dirty little secret. There were no tariffs on dryers. That was just opportunistic price gouging. And for what it's worth, with so few companies actually manufacturing all the different brands of washing machines, we also saw that actually those companies took the opportunity to raise prices of washing machines in Canada, where there were no tariffs. So there's a lot of that. People have probably seen some of the big retailers saying, in anticipation of tariffs, we're raising prices. That's price gouging. And we need policies against that, because working people have suffered a lot from the offshoring we've seen, particularly related to China, but not exclusively. And we need a transition to more balanced trade. But consumers and workers shouldn't have to pay for that. The companies that profited so richly from the old system should be taking it out of their big profits. And then when you have balanced trade, we're going to have higher wages if this is done right. And that transition will end up with more resilience, more national security by us having both the ability to make more stuff, but also we need more diverse import sources. We can't be so, as the committee, the special committee has pointed out, we can't be so reliant on so many things being made almost exclusively in China. That's bad. And now I can't hear you.
How about now? Can you hear me?
Yes, sir.
Sorry about that. The Chinese did not like my my observations on the last point. I hope that you kept going though. And maybe can I turn to another topic, which is, I guess, where do you see things going from here? How do you see things playing out? And what is your outlook with regard to tariffs? And you can take China, but you can also pivot to other, our neighbors as well.
Well, let me just say one more thing about the China tariffs to just get everyone situated. So what I said is what's supposed to happen as far as the percentages. Here's the problem. The President Trump on February 1 also announced initially in that executive order that started the first 10% that with respect to China, he was closing the duty-free de minimis exception where you don't get charged the tariffs if stuff comes in, as today 4 million packages a day come in. If they're valued under $800 per shipment, each person in the US gets $800 per day duty-free under this old loophole. Folks who remember, this is like when you come in on the plane and you get that form that says you have stuff that's more than $200, duty-free, don't have to do the customs. If it's over, start writing down your list. Okay, so for commercial stuff, it's $800. It was a big push by, the Amazons and the express delivery guys to get that number up. So here's our problem. He closed that loophole because otherwise all that stuff would get around the tariffs. The only tariffs that get charged supposedly are anti-dumping tariffs. Otherwise, Section 301 tariffs, IEEPA tariffs, steel tariffs, all that stuff, so get out of jail free card. Now, obviously, I-beams coming in, that's more than $800. That stuff's getting a tariff. But right now, there's over $100 billion of de minimis stuff that came in 2024, $100 billion. So it's not a little bit. And most of it comes from China. So it was a great thing they closed that duty-free loophole, except the next week, President Trump met with the CEO of FedEx and reversed. So right now, Congressman, despite on paper, all of those tariffs I've mentioned being put in place, the thing that the special committee has had in several of its annual reports, both of its annual reports, is close the de minimis loophole so we actually can charge the tariffs. And President Trump first did for a week, and then he reopened it, and it remains open. So those tariffs are not getting charged. So with respect to what's going to happen on April 2nd, all signs are they're not going to roll back the existing China tariffs. A very big question, though, is, are they going to end up collecting them? Because if they don't start closing the de minimis loophole, it's a workaround. And it's not hypothetical as a workaround, because actually the amount of stuff coming in evading tariffs through de minimis went through the ceiling during the first round of tariffs. That's when the volume exploded, because suddenly in Trump 1, holy beans, tariffs. And so they're breaking down shipments, they're sneaking around the tariffs. So what actually happens one of the things we have to look at really closely is on April 2nd, are they closing that trapdoor, that loophole? Because otherwise, whatever you have on paper, there's a sneak around.
Can you tell us what you think is going to happen on April 2nd?
So I wish that my crystal ball were more reliable, but I'm guessing based on no inside information, but understanding somewhat of what some of the officials involved see as the concerns. I think we may see a combination of tariffs with respect to specific sectors of the economy that are deemed either essential for national security. And I think we're going to talk about the different authorities you can use for different things. So things that we need to make, like the tariffs we've seen already put in place in steel and aluminum, but perhaps some other sectors like medicines, things that we learned during COVID, we cannot be so overly reliant on one or two countries. We need diversified imports. We need to make some of it ourselves. We basically need to step back from this very hyper-globalized system and have more resilience. We need that for our health. We need that for our national security. So I think that there will be some sectoral tariffs. And then I think they're going to aim at tariffing the countries that are called the chronic surplus countries. That's a relatively short list of countries, of which China by far is the biggest by value. But there are currently 16 countries in the world that have chronic, large, persistent trade surpluses. And they are using, what are sometimes called beggar thy neighbor policies or mercantilist policies, the kind of things we know China does. So, enormous subsidies, everything, every element of production subsidized. The land is free. The factory construction is paid for by the government. The water and electricity is subsidized by the government. The workforce is, basically has wages so low, either by crushing independent unions or in Vietnam and China, just saying this is the wage. The shipping of the goods to a port is subsidized. The shipping out of the port is subsidized so that the good comes in at a price that no matter how efficient you are, you can't compete. And in addition, these countries in that list of chronic surplus countries also have a tendency to try and basically manipulate currency values, either pushing up the dollar or devaluing their currency to get an advantage in addition. Because, when the good comes in, it's denominated in whatever the foreign currency is, and then it gets converted to dollars. So if the value, basically you can get a benefit, even if you didn't have all those other subsidies, on the currency value. So all of those countries, I suspect, are going to be countries that will probably be priority targets. There are some other countries that have chronic surpluses, but they're oil and gas exporters, for instance, and that's why. The ones that are the manufacturing surplus countries, I suspect, will be targeted.
Let's see. You're allergic to these tariffs. By the way, for those chronic surplus countries, can you just give us a flavor for some of them, like who are like top of mind?
So China is the biggest one by far, by like a large chunk of that column is China. But then there's some that would surprise you. Germany is up there. The Netherlands is up there. They basically have this benefit of trading in the euro. Like if they were trading in a Deutschmark or they were trading in a guilder, before the euro, the value of their currency would be a lot higher. Because they're in this mixed bucket, they basically have a currency. They're not manipulating volitionally, but they get the same benefit of having their goods be much less expensive than they would be if their currency represented the value and strength of their economy. In addition, Taiwan, Japan, Korea, there are others, but here's a thing folks should just think about when we see what happens in April 2nd. Mexico is now a global deficit country. There are 62 countries that are chronic deficit countries. These are our partners who, if we were united, would want, and the balanced countries, would want to raise tariffs on the chronic surplus countries as a group and have a different set of tariff rates between us versus the countries that are the mercantilists. So Mexico is now in that bucket with us. We are by far the biggest chronic deficit country, and we take an enormous share of China's chronic surplus. So it's not a coincidence that the US and the China are the biggest ones in either side of that mess. But Mexico is now actually a global deficit country. So we've got a particular problem with Mexico and their system of low wages and their proximity to us and being used as an export platform for other countries to get duty-free into the US under NAFTA and then USMCA. That's a problem we need to fix through USMCA renegotiation. But they are a deficit country, and Mexico now has sanctions, tariffs against China too. So those mercantilist countries are flattening countries around the world. And a lot of the ones we used to think of as countries that were basically the problem are now deindustrializing at the hands of China as well.
Okay, so on April 2nd, you think that there's going to be tariffs that are levied primarily on those chronic surplus countries relative to the US, and you named a handful of them. How about with regard to Canada and Mexico? What do you think is going to happen on that front? For Illinois, for instance, that my home state, people are very, very worried about what's especially going to happen with Canada, because so many inputs are brought in from Canada. And then we do have a fair amount of auto manufacturing, at least subcomponents, if not entire vehicles, that are happening in Illinois as well. And there's a lot of cross-border kind of shipments. So can you talk a little bit about Canada and Mexico for a second?
Yes, sir. Before we go there, just one thing I want to just clarify, which is the surplus countries are not countries that have just a bilateral surplus with the United States. That 16 set of countries have a surplus with the world. Okay. So if you're a big mercantilist, you have a global, and it's the global, when I say I think there'll be two prongs, I think there'll be tariffs in particular sectors that are ones that are deemed to be strategically important. So in the same way we already have them on steel and aluminum, medicines, I can't tell you it's going to be right on April 2nd, but there are sectors. And this is not dissimilar from what the Biden administration was doing, just different sectors. So the Biden administration focused its industrial policy and its highest tariffs on things like sustainable renewable energy, or on the technologies to have EVs, to have a system of transportation in the future that is climate friendly. Not saying the Trump folks are going to focus on those things, as we've seen, unfortunately, but they are going to focus on certain sectors, some of which will overlap. Everyone agrees on steel and aluminum. Everyone agrees on medicine. That was one of the sectors that the Biden administration also had listed as in its critical supply chain reviews, that we are so reliant right now on imports from India and from China. But the scary thing is the generics that come from India, all those active pharmaceutical ingredients come from China. So India is reliant on China. So at the point that the Chinese medicine production system comes apart, the whole world is without basic categories of medicines. So we just, for our own security and health, we need to diversify. There need to be more supplies. So there'll be some combination of sectors and some combination of tariffs on the countries that are the persistent global surplus countries, I suspect. Then what happens with Canada and Mexico? So Canada and Mexico are not in the global surplus targets. And Canada and Mexico to date have been sanctioned under a theory of using tariffs as a sharp stick to try and punish countries over things unrelated to trade. There is an argument to be made that the use of the particular stop fentanyl and stop undocumented migration could be an argument for the kind of authority that was used. You need to show a national crisis to use the authority that was used for those tariffs. So is that why those particular issues were pointed out? They are a crisis. It's just not a crisis with respect to Canada. So there is a real issue on fentanyl with Mexico and with China. There is no doubt there. But what happens with the tariffs under a statute called IEEPA, the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which is what those original China, Mexico, and Canada tariffs that start on February 1 are about, whether that goes forward or those sunset in relationship to the increase of now the more trade and economic focused tariffs, that is something above my pay grade to know.
Hey, let me jump in and ask you something that it just dawned on me the other day when I was talking to, so Catherine Tai came in and spoke to us as well, the former U.S. trade representative, and she was talking about how this actually generates revenue for the government. And I went and looked up the amount of revenue. It's about $77 billion a year in revenue for the government. So here's my question to you. If the president decides to put these tariffs in place, do you sense that if he were to put the tariffs in place on those surplus countries, for instance, are we talking about potentially doubling tariff revenue? Is that maybe one of the underlying themes here that's going on, which is getting a lot of tariff revenue to help pay for, I don't know, tax cuts as part of the reconciliation package, and so forth?
So the irony is, if they raise the tariffs, but they don't close the de minimis loophole, it's a little bit like shoveling water into a sieve, which is just going to come right out the bottom through the loophole. But yes, assuming they close the loophole and they actually get the money from higher tariffs, they would increase the revenue. But the problem with that is that we all heard at some point during the campaign, President Trump say something where, I'm a lawyer, I am not an economist, but even I could do this math. There is no dang way that increasing tariffs, because let me tell you what the rate would have to be, on basically everything would have enough money for the tax cuts for the billionaires to set them aside. So when he was saying, we're going to make foreign countries pay, no, actually, the importer pays, but we're going to have that pay for tax cuts. No, it wouldn't cover it. The theory of his case is looking back to one of his favorite periods in the 1800s where tariffs were the main revenue source and there was no income tax, and somehow that paid for the country being developed, railroads, canals, etc. The difference is there was very little actual governance. There were no healthcare programs. There was no Social Security. There was no Medicare. There was no Medicaid. There was no federal highway system. The things that we have the benefit of. There was no VA system. The things that the government now runs on behalf of all of us. There was no food safety and inspection system. All of those things that we need to live well and to be secure, that's more revenue needed to support that than tariffs could possibly come up with. And you'd have to have tariff rates so high, it would just be, autarky, prohibitive, nothing that even Trump was imagining to do.
Well, Lori, I have to get to another congressional engagement right now. I know the audience has a bunch of questions and Rory is here to moderate. Is it okay if Rory then moderates these questions to you? Because I've monopolized all of your time, your Q&A time at this point. And I am so grateful for you being here. And I hope that we can talk again, because I think this is very informative to me. I think the takeaway, I'm just going to summarize a big takeaway that I have from this conversation, which is the de minimis loophole, as long as it exists, would undercut any of the efforts by the Trump administration to either generate revenue from tariffs or do anything else that they want to achieve through policy with the tariffs, because people will break things down and then bring it through the de minimis. And, there's all kinds of other problems as well that occur. But that's kind of a big takeaway for me. So thank you for pointing that out over and over again.
I appreciate that. There is a strategic use of tariffs that, particularly if we could coordinate with the other many deficit or balanced countries, we could actually force a shift that no amount of lawsuits, WTO enforcement, et cetera, has been able to force on those chronic surplus countries. And the irony is it would be good for people in those countries because they actually would have a better standard of living if they were actually in the position of consuming some of the stuff they're making versus actually having their quality of life suppressed. to export it all and dump it on us. And so there is a vision of how you use tariffs to have more balanced trade. Trade imbalance as a macroeconomic prediction deindustrializes the country with the deficit and increases income equality. And we have seen that horribly in this country. So there is a strategic way to use tariffs. A lot of accompanying policies are needed to make them not be damaging to consumers and workers so that workers get the benefit, not just stock buybacks. But there is a way to do it. But if you want to collect any of that money, the first thing you have to do is plug the hole of de minimis. Thank you, sir.
Thank you, sir. Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, Congressman, and thank you, Lori, for the informative chat. We do have a few more minutes for audience questions, so please do submit them in the Q&A or the chat in here. But in the meantime, I do have a question for Lori. I know that folks are worried about the price of everyday goods. We covered this a little bit earlier, but research shows us that those threats may not materialize in a way that impacts family budgets. And where they do, it's corporations that have chosen to pass prices on to consumers. Meanwhile, tariffs can help us to diversify our supply chains, insulating our economy from an adversary who may choose to inflict economic pain on the U.S. economy at any time. Can you speak a little bit to the various trade-offs of putting tariffs on the PRC?
So I think there is, Rory, there is no way we are going to be able to deal with the severe mercantilist policies that China employs, not just against us, but against, as I said, this growing list of countries, including a lot of sort of middle-tier, quasi-developed countries that are being deindustrialized, like Mexico. I mean, there are a lot of Latin American countries now, South Africa. These countries have, like we have, tariffs against China because this kind of severe beggar thy neighbor policy, number one, you can't export your way into balance against that. But number two, you can't, no matter how efficient you are, no matter how smart you are, you can't compete with that kind of cheating. So with respect to these dire imbalances, where tariffs, because you have to deal with it on the import side, you just have to keep out those unfair imports. You can have fair trade with the countries that aren't behaving that way under good rules, but the countries that are doing that distort the whole thing. Like the benefit of trade, if it's working, obviously, is everyone is better off. But you should never have, if trade is working properly, long periods of very large deficits or surpluses. Currencies are supposed to basically revalue to balance when you have a deficit, because the US dollar is the global currency that is the basis of exchange. It is basically playing a role where other countries are having the ability to shape its value. We, amongst all countries, are not having, as the global reserve currency is called, are not having the ability to adjust. But there is no way around tariffs being part of that solution. And as the Select Committee has pointed out, there are also national security implications for that. We just need to have resilience implications. We just need to have more diversified sources. We're not going to make it all ourselves, but we need to have more import sources. So that combination is essential. And then the question is, what's the trade-off? And so we definitely can come up with different kinds of anti-price gouging mechanisms that can basically bring down the prices, the gouging that we see companies who are either retail importers or who are people importing parts want to pass on into the final product. So those are things where, for instance, when you think about if you're going to use tariffs to get balance, what are two other really important policies? One, we have to ban stock buybacks, and we have to have it easier to organize a union so that the gains of protection go to working people, not just to investors. And number two, we need anti-price gouging rules. We need very strong competition policy enforcement. Because the way I see it is consumers and workers have basically taken in the shorts over the last 30 years of this model of unbalanced trade. Let the companies that profited so much and they have such low tax rates pay for the transition. Once we're back in balance, we're not going to have the problems that you're describing. But there will be a transition, and the question is who pays?
And in the meantime, can you talk a little bit about any scenarios in which the PRC has used its dominance over certain supply chains to jack up prices for Americans? There are, of course, a lot of price pressures going on here, or potential price pressures going on here, and that is one of them. My mind immediately goes to one of the most dire situations that PRC agglomeration has facilitated, and that is, of course, during the pandemic when we had essential healthcare workers wearing trash bags and masks that they had been reusing for far too long because of capricious export controls on Chinese products in a supply chain that they largely control.
So there are price implications, but there are also supply implications. So when you have either one source or only a few sources in the world, you have a variety of risks. Number one, you've got natural disaster and health crises that just without intention take down that supply. So how was it we were so short on antibiotics during COVID? That's because a disproportionate amount of antibiotics, the only place where there is basically a large supply that's coming, non-generic ones, Italy. And you recall Italy, there was a very bad period of pandemic and then they were in trouble. We didn't get that supply. So, but for China, there are certain things where China has systematically, intentionally cornered the market. And either once they have cornered the market, they raise the price, or they just deny critical minerals, rare earths. Part of the retaliation that China has made for these tariffs right now is basically trying to take advantage of the fact we are so reliant on them right now. So they have simply denied certain kinds of products being exported to U.S. companies that need them as part of their own manufacturing. That's why we must make more of this stuff ourselves and diversify our import sources.
That's great. Thank you,
I'm
Lori.
just giving you the 3-minute warning that I need to be, unfortunately, off at quarter after.
Sure. We'll give you one last question and then we'll let everyone go. I know everyone has a busy day ahead of them. One question from the audience is, can you talk about what tariffs could accomplish long term? It's unlikely the tariffs would return America to the industrial era, but as you mentioned, if used strategically, could be beneficial. Other than closing the de minimis loophole, how can we ensure tariffs are actually effective?
So there are different kinds of tariffs. There is the kind of tariff you use, as I described, ideally implemented with all of your trade partners to force rebalance, very important. There are the tariffs you use for strategic sectors, be they for national security, for public health, like medicines, and you need to combine that kind of tariff use with other industrial policies. A tariff alone is not going to get the investment you need to basically have some domestic capacity, but also to diversify your import sources by not letting one just dominate. So, for instance, we saw, sadly unheralded, the highest rate in factory investment in the United States in 30 years was derived from the combination of the Biden administration raising tariffs way above what Trump 1 had and doing the rest of the industrial policies with respect, for instance, to EVs, wind turbines, solar. So it's a combination of things, but doing that together for strategic sectors, you can basically get in the key areas you want more investment. And then the number 3 thing is enforcement. So, for a lot of people who think like, ooh, what is a tariff? Well, friends, if you care about carbon border adjustment mechanisms, the equalizing mechanism so that imported things that have high carbon use production are not trashing the lower carbon production you push in other countries, a CBAM is a tariff. It's a border adjustment, adding a tariff to internalize the cost. If you care about the enforcement of labor standards and trade agreements, like the USMCA's rapid response mechanism, the penalty is a tariff. You basically penalize the bad behavior with the tariff. Or for that matter, all of the product-specific anti-trade cheating remedies are what's called a countervail. You take away economically the benefit of cheating in the domestic market by adding the price back in so that the domestic or a more fairly produced import actually has a chance. So those are real strategic good uses of tariffs. What is not smart, what is not useful is tariff roller coaster. So the on and off tariffs that the Trump administration has been putting in, taking out on Mexico and Canada, et cetera, that is not going to gain the reliability to have investors come in and want to actually build more plants here because they don't know they're going to get a return. It basically is, in fact, causing economic chaos and some damage, the stock market going all over, people jacking up prices, anticipating companies jacking up prices, anticipating tariffs. There's real economic damage without any of the upsides. Also targeting things that have nothing to do with trade or manufacturing, but basically bully stick. So Denmark, we're going to hit you with a tariff. You don't give us Greenland. Those kind of things obviously are not going to result in the things that, a lot of Americans across the political spectrum, we want more resilience. We want to make some more stuff here. We want less income inequality. We don't want to be dependent on one or two sources, certainly not China, but frankly, even more friendly countries. In the turbulent times we live in, you can't have all your eggs in one basket for the things you need just to keep your country safe and secure.
Thank you, Lori. Very well put. I see we are over time. I want to thank you for joining today and lending us your deep insight on this important area of trade policy, and thank all of our attendees for taking time out of their busy days to come and learn more about China tariff policy. With that, we'll call it a wrap. Thank you very much, folks.